Awesome, thank you. So my name is Amber Woodside. I use she and they pronouns. This slide says I'm 22. I'm actually 23 now. I turned 23 on Sunday, so I should have updated that. But I am a co-chair of the Youth Voice Amplified Subcommittee at the Association of Maternal and Child Health Programs. And I am also an editorial board member at Youth Engaged for Change. And my co-presenter today is Stasi.
Thanks, Amber. Hi, everyone. I'm Stasi Snelling. I use she, her pronouns. I am 24. I am a youth partner with Rise Above Colorado, and I am also a supervisor for the Teen Center at Teens Inc. And as we get started, we would love to do some quick introductions to get to know all of you. We would love to hear your actual voices if you're able and willing. Please share your name, pronouns, if you're comfortable sharing them. And also, if you were an ice cream, what flavor would you be? And you're welcome to just shout out in case people aren't comfortable sharing out loud.
My name is Peyton, he, him pronouns. I work at Inside Out Youth Services. So I'm excited to see this presentation. So thanks for putting it together. And if I were a flavor of ice cream, I think I'd be the kind that has like an actual caramel swirl in it because, you know, turn up.
Hi, my name is Jamima Safi. My pronouns are she and hers. And if I were an ice cream of some sort, I would be, I think, strawberry flavored. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Anna. I'm a youth advisor with Boulder County Public Health. And I think if I were to be a cake flavor or ice cream, I would do like raspberry gelato.
My name is Lauren Bradley. I'm a youth supervisor with the City and County of Denver in Denver, Calc. I use she, her pronouns, and if I were an ice cream flavor, I'd probably say like pina colada or something, just something tropical.
Hi, my name is Isaiah. I'm 22. I use he, him pronouns. I work with Denver Health Institute as a part of their youth cohort, and I would be a cheesecake blizzard from Dairy Queen.
Howdy, everyone. I am Jack Jordan. I work with Mason County Public Health as their apprentice. And if I had to choose an ice cream, it'd probably be mint chocolate chip.
Hi, my name is Lily. This is my daughter, Marigold. She's hanging out today because she doesn't feel super good. My pronouns are she, her, and if I was an ice cream, I think I would be bubblegum because I have some, there's little bits of bubblegum hidden inside me, and that's the best part, right? And I work for the Montana Youth Action Board, and I also work for the Harmony House here in Billings, helping young women, young moms.
Hey, I'm Rehan Reed with Youth Engaged for Change. That's how I know Amber. My pronouns are he and they. And if I were an ice cream, I'd be a vanilla chocolate swirl, soft serve ice cream with sprinkles, because I remember how excited I was to get those when I was a kid. And I just like the idea of mixing it up.
All right, is there anybody who hasn't gone, or was that everyone? All right, I think that was everyone. If we, Anya, please feel free to leave that info in the chat. Liz, if we could have the next slide, please. And we're just going to start you off with a brief overview of what this presentation is going to look like. I say presentation, but it's a little bit more interactive than. We're going to start out with an introduction of what positive youth development is and what it means. And then we're going to do some affirmations real quick because we know that it can be really hard to feel like you deserve to be treated well as a young person in professional spaces. We're going to have a stretch break after that affirmation section. Then we're going to have a third speaker coming in to talk about the history of positive youth development. Then we're going to talk about why we're using PYD now and how to recognize when it's being used well or sometimes when it's not being used as well. We're going to have another stretch break because I know nobody likes to sit for 2 hours straight. And then we're going to go over some self-advocacy strategies, how to advocate for your organization to use positive youth development principles if you've recognized that they're not doing that. And then we're going to have a Q&A session, and then we'll just do a brief wrap up and talk about some resources. So we can go ahead and head to the next slide.
Thanks. So to start us off, we're just going to watch a 3-minute video that gives us a brief overview of what positive youth development is to get us thinking and to help anyone who maybe hasn't heard of it before to envision what it is.
The young people of Colorado are diverse, unique, and talented. We all have a role to play in recognizing and growing those strengths. And that means you. You play an important part in the growth of Colorado youth, who they are, what they learn, and where they go in the future. The Positive Youth Development Framework was designed to empower The young people of Colorado are diverse, unique, and talented. We all have a role to play in recognizing and growing those strengths, and that means you. You play an important part in the growth of Colorado youth, who they are, what they learn, and where they go in the future. The Positive Youth Development Framework was designed to empower you to effectively collaborate with and support young people as they grow. Between the ages of 9 and 25, young people undergo big and frequent changes. They become more independent, more self-reliant, and more confident in who they are. As adults who work with youth, our support and programs must serve them where they are and grow with them through life's changes. Positive Youth Development, or PYD, is a framework that focuses on authentic relationships, essential skills, and opportunities to practice those skills. PYD is not a program, but an approach to how we engage in our work as trusted adults and communities. The PYD approach is about transforming how we do business as usual to support youth in reaching their full potential. The PYD framework can be used by anyone that serves and supports youth, no matter the focus of your organization. The PYD framework is about youth engagement at the heart. PYD shows organizations how to invest in youth over time and give young people the support they need to thrive. Youth development programs can put several key protective factors in place for youth. These include supportive relationships, opportunities to belong, opportunities for skill building, and a sense of safety. How will PYD help you do your work better? Youth-serving organizations that use a PYD approach see higher levels of youth engagement, better learning outcomes among young people, more sustainable programs, and deeper connections with other organizations across their communities. Now that you have an idea of how this framework is designed to help you and the youth that you work with, let's walk through the principles that make up the PYD framework. First, PYD is strengths-based. The framework takes a holistic approach by focusing on the strengths of an individual, family, or community, and then building upon them. PYD is inclusive. It addresses the needs of all youth by ensuring the youth services are culturally responsive. Next, PYD engages young people as partners. This framework helps you recognize youth as equal partners in your programs and practices so that they feel ownership in the work you are doing. PYD is collaborative. It encourages you to create meaningful partnerships within and across sectors to effectively align your work with other like-minded organizations. And finally, PYD is sustainable. It ensures the youth programs in Colorado are around long-term. At the core, PYD is a belief that youth are not problems to fix. They are resources to cultivate. The PYD framework can support and empower you as you partner with the youth of Colorado to help them reach their highest potential. If you want to learn more about positive youth development, you can watch our other videos that explain these principles in depth. You can also find a PYD training in your area by going to pydinaction.com.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. We can go to the next slide. So that video was put out by the Colorado Department of Health and Environment. And as you listen to the video, you may have heard this, but basically their tagline is that positive youth development develops skills, opportunities, and authentic relationships using the 5 principles: strengths-based, inclusive, youth as partners, collaborative, and sustainable, to inform policies, practices, and programs. While they state that skills, opportunities, and authentic relationships are central to this model, it's actually been surprisingly difficult to find specific information on those 3 pieces. Regardless of this, I personally really do believe that they are foundational to PYD. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about them before Amber gets into each of the main principles with you. For skills development, I found an example in one of the other videos on their website that says PYD helps build skills that youth will use now and in the future. To know what to do and why they're doing it, youth need to know how the skills they're building today are meaningful and relevant to their lives. Basically, this is how we train for the nuts and bolts of how the work gets done. Skills are talents or abilities that allow someone to do the work they're assigned properly and comfortably. For opportunities to practice, I summarized another video. They say that practice is particularly important when those skills that are meaningful and relevant to youth lives are not reinforced at school or other traditional environments. They recommend using productive and engaging learning environments to help foster this practice. Basically, this is how we build skills. And for building authentic relationships, I found this quote related to youth as partners, one of the principles. Authentic relationships provide opportunities for youth to foster connections and build strong relationships with adults and peers and develop a sense of belonging. Basically, I find that this makes the work more fun, engaging, effective, and also ensures that there is a high but appropriate level of care between coworkers. And now I'll hand it off to Amber.
Thank you, Stasi. And yeah, next slide, please. Thanks so much. So the main principles for PYD are, as we saw in the video, strengths-based, inclusive, engaging youth as partners, collaborative, and sustainable. So I'm going to take a couple minutes to break those down in a little bit plainer language. So first off is strengths-based, which really just means that organizations are going to find ways for your work to use the skills that you already have, and also be aware of skills you might want to build or begin building that you don't have yet. This serves to help you know that you're capable and competent, and also make sure that you're able to do effective work that isn't redundant or so difficult and outside your wheelhouse that it makes you feel overwhelmed. And then for inclusive, not only is an organization doing its best to keep any traumatic experiences out of the workplace, regardless of someone's identities, but also in general, they should be making sure that everyone is treating young people as respectfully as they treat anyone else. That's in terms of not only behavior and interactions, but also logistics like scheduling, pay rate, and so on. And then for engaging youth as partners, this really just refers to the belief that informs the building of those authentic relationships that Stasi just mentioned. If you're engaged as a partner, you are a full and equal member of the space. Your work is noticed and appreciated, and it's also actually being used in serving whatever the mission of the organization might be. Collaboration doesn't only refer to working well and effectively with you as a youth partner, but also to supervisors and trusted adults, making sure that they're seeking out the right resources to help you, whether that's making sure you have the right trainer for the right skill, or like seeking out connections and contact information for your work and goals that you might not have been able to get on your own. It's really just actions that contribute to making sure you're supported effectively. And then finally, sustainability just means that the positive experience that young people are hopefully having in an organization can continue to happen even when individuals change. So this will come down to maybe things like official policies being put in place revolving around the treatment of young people, or even just making sure that supervisors and trusted adults who do PYD really well have the opportunity to look at and maybe even train incoming replacements in how to do just as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the model that the official PYD toolkit uses as kind of a measurement system to see how well an organization is doing with a particular PYD principle or component. The planting part is kind of the beginning stage when an organization is trying to think about PYD while they're doing their work, or maybe planning their workplace organization structures. And then you move on to the growing stage, which would reflect when an organization is always trying to uphold PYD, no matter what they're doing, and is showing that in some structured ways, like implementing some written policies. And then that final stage is blossoming, which will show an organization that uses PYD really effectively and in all aspects of the work. It's not to say that they quit analyzing themselves and making sure that they're still working on doing better all the time, but that it's just going about the best it can go. You can replace this scale in your own brain with literally anything. You can do levels 1, 2, and 3, or bronze, silver, and gold medals, whatever works for you, but just know that there are definitely stages at which you can identify how an organization is doing with actually using those PYD principles in practice. There's good, better, and best, basically. And we'll move on to the next slide, which is going to be an activity. Yay.
Thanks, Amber. That was an awesome overview. So I know we kind of went through the principles really fast. In a little bit, we're going to have you break out into groups. If you want to take a picture or a screenshot of this slide, it has the 5 principles on it. So that might be helpful in your breakout groups. But we wanted to give you all a chance to actually discuss some of the examples, some real life examples of PYD. But before we do that, Amber and I are going to share some examples that we have of each principle. I will start. For strengths-based, I was provided feedback on projects or tasks that I worked on. I was encouraged to do things that weren't super comfortable for me, like facilitation, also so that I could grow that as a skill. So it was things that I was already really good at and things that I needed to learn. They always made me feel valued for the things I was good at and that my opinion inherently mattered. They encouraged me to continually improve and grow, but never made me feel like mistakes were unacceptable. They always framed them as learning opportunities. One specific example I have of building skills and opportunities to practice is that when I first joined the organization, I was terrified of public speaking, but I was able to build confidence and practice this in a way that felt safe. I started watching colleagues present and acted as an audience member. I was then asked my opinion on some presentations, and soon after, my supervisor asked me if I would come present with her if the timing worked. I was only comfortable sharing examples of my own experience with the audience at that time, and so that's what I did. I continued presenting at least a couple times a year to different people and slowly built up my confidence and learned what methods of presenting worked best for me. Over time, I became more comfortable sharing more and more content in the presentations as I became more familiar with the material. For inclusive, the best example I have is that the first day of work with Rise Above Colorado, we had to go to downtown Denver, which scared me so much, and I didn't have a great vehicle. My executive director straight up offered to pick me up and to take me home so that I had accessibility to attend the meetings without having to navigate downtown or pay for parking. Engaging youth as partners. As I mentioned before, I was always made to feel like my opinion inherently mattered, which is a good sign, but it makes it hard to identify like the tangible things this organization actually did. One specific thing they did from the beginning was that I was involved in all staff meetings and I had an equal voice and vote in making decisions about the organizations and programs. and they never asked me to provide the youth perspective, but simply my perspective as a young person. And I find that to be a really important distinction. On the other hand, my supervisor did a lot of work to make sure that I wasn't being asked to do everything or being pulled into too many tasks when I had a very limited time at 10 hours a week. I'm not sure exactly what it looks like from her end, but I also felt like the things I was asked to participate in were relevant to me and that I understood what was being talked about or had the space to ask questions. Collaborative, my supervisor and organization connect me to other groups to grow my professional development in things that I wanted to know about, even if it had little specific relevance to our job. This was explained to me that most of what I did, what I was asking for, would still help me in this current job to provide a more encompassing youth perspective. So I had trainings in public speaking, which was specifically relevant to my job, but I also had trainings on biases and equity, as well as strategies to support youth. For sustainable, this is one that's probably the most difficult for me to come up with an example. And I guess the best way I can explain that this showed up for me was that I knew my organization had budgeted properly and had diverse enough funding that I never had to worry about losing my job or not being reimbursed for travel. I had parameters for how much they budgeted for me to work, but if there was a chance of me going over that, it was never a big deal. They reassured me that they would be able to pay me. Sustainable also includes evaluation, and I'll give an example of this later on. And lastly, for relationships, I wanted to highlight building authentic relationships because I have found this to be vital to a welcoming and effective work environment. When I joined the organization and throughout my supervisor's entire time there, she was extremely intentional about giving us time to get to know each other, and I was paid for a lot of this time when it was at work. I realized as we did this that a lot of our sharing about life would naturally turn into discussions about how to apply lessons we learned in life to the work we were doing. This allowed us to bounce ideas off of each other, and work flowed a lot easier because we understood how the other person worked. In addition, she became one of my most amazing mentors, and we have evolved into friends. We still even talk, although we have different jobs now, and I'm able to ask her for advice on life or my new job, which feels really good. It won't always turn out this way, but when building relationships is done well and authentically, it makes the work so much better. And now I'm going to turn it over to Amber for some examples.
Yeah, and Stasi gave a lot of really great examples, so I'm only going to give a couple just to give a little bit further detail. So one example of one of my organizations engaging me as a young person as a partner, in that internship at YVA, I'm allowed to take like full lead on some larger projects. Like my mentor there allows me to handle the decision making and operations for the team, who are also young people. And then my mentor is just kind of available for support and logistics rather than being someone that I have to get permission from or take direction from, which is really allowing me to just explore being in a position of leadership, which is awesome. And then in collaboration, this might sound like kind of a small example, but it's a big deal to me. My mentor on my other main internship right now actually gave me a recommendation for a summer intern opportunity I'm applying for, which is run by the same agency that's running this current one. And he did this without me even having to ask or even intending to ask. And the interviewer mentioned that he had heard really good things about me from my mentor. And in doing this, you know, my current mentor really opened up an opportunity for me more than I would have had by working with someone that he already had a connection to, which was a really great example of collaboration. And then I wanted to provide also one kind of more negative example because, you know, it mentions on this slide, you can think about maybe where you've seen your organization fail at meeting some of these principles, and that's something we really want to encourage you to do in the breakout session. So as far as inclusivity goes, One way I saw a former organization that I worked with fail at inclusivity was when I was working on my mental health, and I chose to share with my direct supervisor that my psychiatrist was considering evaluating me for autism, which it turns out a couple of years later, surprise, I am in fact autistic. I shared that my psychiatrist was just thinking about it in kind of a desperate attempt to get my supervisor to stop being so upset with me when I spoke louder than she wanted me to, because I forget my own volume sometimes. And I thought maybe it would make her finally realize that I wasn't yelling at her. And instead, she then passed the information on to our department head by saying that I had already received a diagnosis. And they then took the whole thing to the HR department, insisting that I needed to be reevaluated for fitness of duty, despite the fact that even if I had actually received an autism diagnosis at that time, it's not exactly something you come down with that would have changed any of my abilities to do my job. So that was one way that inclusivity really wasn't met in that organization for me as a young person. So Stasi, I'll let you finish the instructions for the breakout.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing that vulnerable story as well. So now we want all of you to have a chance to talk in small groups about examples of where you've seen your organization succeeding or struggling to meet each principle. We ask that before discussing, your group chooses someone to take notes, and we also ask that you try to think of at least one example for each principle, even if it's just one example within your small group. It's important to take notes, as we will be asking you to post them in the chat when we get back for others to see different examples. And we will be coming back to these examples to discuss them as a larger group later. We will check in after about 10 minutes to see how it's going and see how much more time each group may need. If you finish before other groups, we would encourage you to get to know each other better, perhaps discuss what programs or organizations you are involved in and what kind of things you work on. And I will now let Liz send you into groups.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Almost got everybody back. Okay, cool, there we go. Liz, if you want to start the slides again, we'll be starting on the affirmations slide. Great, thank you super much. So we know that advocating in spaces where you might already feel like you don't have a lot of power or authority is really, really difficult. We've both had to do it. Coming out on the other side, though, once someone listens and gives you the tools you need, you realize you've deserved the respect and the acknowledgement the whole time, and you have. Also, imposter syndrome is real. I promise you a significant portion of the people you've listened to and thought were amazing or really competent absolutely felt like they had no idea what they were doing. I can't necessarily say that that ever goes away, but it does get a lot easier to ignore with some practice.
Thanks, Amber. And also before I talk, I'll just remind the note takers for both groups to please put your notes in the chat for us so people can look at those examples whenever they have time. And we can also send them out later. Also, finding a balance between self-advocacy and finding a space that makes you feel really valued already is a difficult line to walk, but it's important to do. It requires a lot of self-reflection, and I'll give a brief example of this. Working for a long time in one organization has allowed me the chance to do a lot of reflection on how I'm valued. I have been very fortunate to feel extremely valued at my organization because they treat me like an adult. They treated me like an adult from day one, asking for my input on organizational decisions. But I also had an amazing supervisor who advocated to hear my voice when I wasn't speaking up and tried to make sure I wasn't being asked to be involved in more things than I could handle with my limited hours. When a new youth came onto this organization, she also felt valued, but also felt very overwhelmed and like a lot of the decisions were being made without us. Around this time, we were also having a lot of staffing changes, including a change to our supervisor. We talked and brought our collective concerns to the whole team. We decided to frame it as opportunities for organizational growth because we loved the organization and wanted them to be receptive to our ask for change. Fortunately, there has since been a lot of intentionality around changing some of our processes to better include and support all staff, including youth. This is another example of sustainability related to evaluation that I referred to earlier. What I took away from this experience was that I had the foundation of good relationships with more than one adult staff member and time feeling valued that allowed me the confidence and skills to problem solve various issues, and having the respect of adult staff resulted in concrete and thoughtful changes. I think about how differently that may have gone if I had never felt valued or had no one left at the organization who respected me. I probably wouldn't have had the emotional capacity or the skills to advocate for the change I knew we needed to see, and likely would have just left the organization. Also, if I hadn't had another youth employee saying, "Hey, this doesn't feel right to me either," I may not have even thought to bring it up. But because I also had the support from a colleague experiencing the same thing, I felt confident in saying and standing to make a change. In addition, I want to point out that sometimes advocacy doesn't lead to the change the way we want. And it's important to recognize that if nothing changes, it is in no way a failure on your part. Lastly, I just want you all to remember that organizations bring on youth because they need your perspective, and you were selected for a specific reason. In my experience, adults get super excited and motivated by the youth perspective, even if they don't know how to show it or make sure you hear it. Do your best to remember that you have inherent value because of the experiences you have lived through.
Thank you, Stasi. We can go to the next slide. So we're almost to the stretch break. We're just going to have a super quick activity. I kind of admittedly called on to my inner boomer a little bit for this, but I think it's a good way to visually represent stuff. So first off, we're going to start by putting words in the chat. Just one word a piece is completely fine, that represents kind of negative or maybe discouraging feelings that we might have about our worth in professional spaces or academic spaces, whatever you kind of resonate more with, just any group setting where you deserve to feel respected. So I'm going to give us about a minute to a minute and a half to do that.
I'm so sorry. Can you repeat that prompt again?
Yeah, for sure. So just one word in the chat that represents your more negative or discouraging feelings about your worth in a professional space or an academic one, just any group setting where you deserve respect and have to work with others. Great. Thank y'all for participating in that. That is obviously not what we want to hang on to. That's not what we're going to leave in the Wordle, but I will read it out. I'm seeing words like unqualified. I see unqualified in a lot of places, which I totally relate to. Immature, incompetent, disorganized, lacking childcare, anxious, unexperienced, deflated, disappointed, and too young. So now we want to flip the script. What is a positive or affirming emotion that you think about when you think about either yourself or your peers? I know sometimes it's hard to be positive for yourself, but maybe people that you work with, just something that's positive or affirming about having young people in the workplace, including yourself.
I just wanted to point out that I noticed that there were a lot faster responses to this one, and that makes me really happy to see.
All right, so I don't know if the word cloud is going to populate right now because Liz is currently in the presentation. However, I did create the word cloud and it's going to be in the slides that'll be sent out afterwards.
Liz, if you exit out of this and then re-enter into it, we can see it. We can also see it when we come back for stretch break, which I just saw we are about to start.
Yeah.
5 minutes, is that correct, Amber?
Yes, so we are going to do a 5-minute stretch break. I like to make it round, so just back at 35 after the hour, wherever you're at, whatever your time zone is. And yeah, feel to get up and do whatever you would like for 5 minutes. You belong to yourselves again. All right, hopefully everyone has had the opportunity to rejoin. If you are back and you're able, please leave like a Zoom reaction or something. um, but we're going to get started on our next section. I would like to introduce Catherine Harvey. She's amazing, and I'm just going to turn it over to her.
Excellent. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, perfect. Tell me if that ends up not being the case because my headphones kind of suck. Liz, are you able to share the slides for me? Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Catherine. Some of you know me. Others of you may not. I used to be a youth employee for several years. I now supervise youth employees. I've done a lot of youth development stuff, and Stasi and Amber asked me to come on and talk a little bit about the history of positive youth development and how that came to be a thing. So I'm literally just gonna rant at you for like 15 minutes about it, and then I'll leave, and hopefully you'll get something out of this tiny mini lecture. So the first thing to know is when I talk about how positive youth development theory started out, we're gonna talk about how the concept of adolescence actually even became a thing in the first place. And I wanna put out a caveat right away that adolescence is just one piece of how we conceptualize life stages. It's a way of categorizing and thinking about a group of people who are a certain age in contrast to other groups of people that are other sets of certain ages. And the way that we think about adolescence is different across different cultures and different societies. This is the European American concept of adolescence as a life stage that's distinct from adulthood versus childhood. And it's really only developed in like the past 150 years. So before that, adolescence wasn't actually a thing. There were children and there were adults, and Europeans and Americans just kind of conceptualized those two things. So that's just sort of to say that, right, if you go to somebody from a different culture, even people like, right, maybe recent immigrants to the United States, they might not conceptualize adolescence the same way that we're talking about it here. The reason I am talking about it that way here is because that is what has informed what is positive youth development in Colorado? What are our frameworks? What has research been done on? Yeah, so next slide, please, Liz. So adolescence started becoming a thing in America in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and it was co-evolving with other science interests in things like studying children as like a sector of the population to do like experiments on and study in particular, and also things like psychology. So this man here is our good friend Stanley, and he was the first president of the American Psychological Association. He wrote this book that you see right there in the center. The book is called Adolescence, Its Psychology and Its Relation to Physiology, Anthropology, Sociology, Sex, Crime, Religion, and Education. This was a 2-volume book. It was written in, or it was published in 1904, and it was kind of like the first book ever that somebody like really sat down and was like, this is what adolescence is, and this is its own life stage, and it's different from being a child, but it's also different from being an adult. So we'll talk a little bit about what his views were, but I also want to like start this conversation with like recognizing that Stanley had like a lot of views which are like not super great. He was a eugenicist, first of all. There was this quote that I found about him that he had no sympathy for the poor, the sick, or those with developmental differences or disabilities. He was a firm believer in selective breeding and forced sterilization. So basically anybody that he considered to be like intellectually or morally or emotionally inferior to him was going to be taken out through the process of natural selection. He was very into like evolution and natural selection to create a human super race. So if that all sounds real bad, yeah, this is the guy who first conceptualized what adolescence was. So I just wanted to like put that out there. So Stanley, he writes this really long book. Again, this is 2 volumes. It's the first time anybody has talked about adolescence as a thing. Some people are super impressed with this book, and it really becomes like this defining influential text for basically the next 50 years in America. Other people, even at the time, are not that impressed with Stanley's book. His science is not super great. He has a friend who's a fellow psychologist whose name is Thorndike, and Thorndike says about this book that it is chock full of errors, masturbation, and Jesus, and that he is a madman. So just kind of some wild context for what adolescence is. According to Stanley, because of the influence of things like child labor laws and universal education, youth now have newfound time in their teenage years when the responsibilities of adulthood were not forced upon them as quickly as the past, which created this like breeding ground for delinquency among the youth, basically. So that's, again, Stanley is saying that because of things like children shouldn't have to work in factories and everyone should have the right to an education, this is a bad thing, and it's created like all this turmoil in society. And now youth delinquency is happening because youth have more free time that they're not spending working and just being adults. And so he believed, that basically it was, here's my quote. He believed that society needed to burn out the vestiges of evil in their nature. That is the nature of the adolescents. Next slide, please, Liz. So Stanley writes his book, 1904. Nobody really pays attention to it for like 50 years, like unless you're a fellow psychologist and you're like, oh, that's kind of interesting, I guess. There's kind of a lot of other stuff going on. There is this development of youth culture as, again, kind of distinct from like childhood or adulthood, and that happens a lot with advances in other kinds of technology like the radio. And then especially with the introduction of TV and going to the movies, we see in the 1950s, post-World War II, suddenly people are kind of like latching on to this idea about like adolescence is a time and youth is the specific life stage that is neither childhood nor adulthood. So people are kind of like more interested in Stanley's work and people who are talking about like what adolescence is. Youth culture is this thing that's becoming socially distinct in the 1950s. And we see that again with technological advances. And also like we see that a lot of the youth in that time period are turning away from kind of like the social mores of their parents, and they're listening to a lot of rock and roll. They're watching a lot of TV and movies and things that adults think are not necessarily appropriate. And there's a lot of racial mixing going on, right? We see that white teenagers are listening to like music from African American musicians like Little Richard, Fats Domino, Chuck Berry, and Black teenagers are listening to white rock and rollers like Elvis. So this is making the adults super uncomfortable, and they're sort of like, it becomes this political thing of adolescence is kind of like this political life stage of, oh God, what are the youth doing? So because of that, we see in the 50s and the 60s, there becomes this total like political agenda and worry about what the youths are doing, and like about teenage pregnancy and teen dropouts and teen runaways and teen substance use, and how are we going to stop those things from happening because it's like slowly corroding society. So this is like the intervention stage of we're gonna like get in there with the youth that are already doing these things, and we're gonna do interventions to make them stop. And then by the time the 70s rolls around, then we see this rise in belief of like, you know, rather than like going and doing these interventions with youth who are already doing these things, maybe we should start thinking about prevention. How can we prevent youth from using drugs in the first place? How can we prevent them from being teen dropouts in the first place? And so you can see that I put a little comic there for you guys. Keep this interesting. Next slide, Liz. And so then in the 80s, there is this lovely woman named Karen Pittman. She does not have as cool of a beard, but her science is way better. And Karen, she is this like badass sociologist, researcher, ends up creating like a bunch of really cool youth serving organizations. And she kind of looks at all this past research and is like, yeah, the prevention is like a better approach than like just the solid like intervention was, but just trying to prevent youth from like using drugs or like whatever like the negative health outcome is that we're trying to prevent, that's not actually necessarily like setting them up for adulthood, and it's not like giving them the assets that are like gonna help them with their lives. And we really need to shift our idea of like this negative way of viewing adolescence to like something that's gonna be more positive. She has a quote. She says that we need to go from fixing these behavior deficits, right? Again, the negative health outcomes or bad behaviors, to building and nurturing all the beliefs, behaviors, knowledge, attributes, and skills that result in a healthy and productive adolescence and adulthood. hopefully that information like sounds kind of familiar to you, because we're getting to the point where like this is what's influencing what becomes PYD in Colorado. So Karen starts doing this research in the 80s, and then by the 90s, she's like become like a pretty high profile lady within the youth development field. And she talks a lot about this positive youth development rather than just like this negative prevention approach. She does tons of research. She creates lots of frameworks that, again, have significantly informed how we think about PYD in Colorado. And really since then, like since the 90s, researchers for the past 30 years have been fleshing out this idea of what are the factors and assets in a young person's life that are making them more or less likely to engage in a certain behavior or more or less likely to experience a certain outcome of some kind, whether that's about health or their education or getting a job or somehow contributing to society, right? So as you can see, this idea of problem-free is not fully prepared, which is a quote of Karen's, starts to sort of like lead and bleed out into these other jargon terms, which I'm sure you guys have probably heard of before, even if you're not super familiar. Does anyone know what a risk factor is? If you think you might know, can you please type in the chat, and I'll give you 30 seconds and I'll stop talking. Risk factor. Anyone know what it is? Ivy says something that makes youth more likely to engage in dangerous behaviors. Yes, Ivy, you pretty much nailed it. Really, basically, it is something that increases risk or susceptibility of a certain outcome. The outcome may be dangerous or it may be unhealthy, right? It's usually something we think of in a negative context of some way. So an example of a risk factor is if you're LGBTQ and you experience discrimination, that discrimination is a risk factor for your mental health outcomes. Like you are more likely to attempt suicide and report experiencing depression in the past year if you have experienced discrimination based off of your orientation or gender identity. Protective factor is like the flip side. And so it's any sort of condition or attribute that an individual or their family or their community has that is promoting health and well-being. So an example of that is, my favorite one is if you have access to a trusted adult that you feel like you can approach and talk to about whatever you need to in your life, you're way more likely to also see better outcomes like across the board for like, in terms of like graduating from high school, trying to like, right, being healthy, having good mental health. We know that if you have access to a trusted adult, you're much more likely to have those other good health outcomes or other outcomes, period. Developmental assets. This is like a really jargony word. Does anybody know what a developmental asset is, or like can give me an example of one? You can type in the chat, developmental asset. Hayden says that there are things like access to healthcare, libraries, trusted adults, etc. Yes, thank you, Payton. You nailed it. A developmental asset is anything that's considered a building block of healthy development that's helping young people grow up to be healthy, caring, responsible, contributing to society, like whatever factor it is that you want to consider. So that's an awesome list of examples. Thank you, Payton. So in like the 1990s, they came up with this list of 40 developmental assets, which was sort of like partly based on Karen's work and her research about what is an asset and what do youth need to be able to, have a good time in their life and to be prepared for adulthood. And so they listed stuff like family support, right? Trusted adults, community service, safety, like if you feel safe at your home, in school, in your neighborhood, etc. Like that is a developmental asset that's going to help prepare you for adulthood. Spending time with youth programs after school, positive peer influence. Like if you have peers that are pushing you to do better in your life, you're like, that's an asset for you in your development. So, right, these are all the things that we would want youth to have. There was also, I want to like note that this was like stuff that was going on in the 90s, and there are still things that like were not great language that they were using. Like it was still very deficit based in a lot of ways. Sometimes we still see this today. One of the 40 developmental assets that they talked about in this paper that was super influential on positive youth development theory was that an asset was restraint, which is when a young person believes it is important not to be sexually active or to use alcohol or drugs, which I would argue is really avoiding any sort of like upstream prevention lens, which is kind of what we want. Instead, it's putting this weird onus on like the individual behavior of youth by being like, oh, well, you know, you're not exhibiting restraint, which is like, rather than looking at what are the contextual reasons that a young person might be choosing to use substances or might be choosing to be sexually active, there's still this weird onus, even in like the 90s and the 2000s, of like, oh, well, it's like we're trying to change these health behaviors of the youth. So anyway, so all this is leading into this like whole corpus of research about what positive youth development is, where we're focusing more on like the assets that youth bring and preparing them for adulthood rather than like stopping the damn teen delinquents from dropping out of high school. Liz, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So where did PYD come from, and where did those principles that Stasi and Amber talked to you through earlier? It came from this really big body of work. But again, like, right, do not have time to go and read through 30 years of research about positive youth development theory. And the state government also needed a way to be able to measure how well are youth serving organizations serving young people? Are they still taking this stop those teen delinquents from like getting on the streets approach? Or are they doing this like this more positive version of being strength-based, trying to help youth have the things that they need to be prepared for adulthood? So essentially people at the state government within the past 20 years, like 15 to 20 years or so, they kind of brought this research together and came up with this standard set. Sorry, my computer's talking to me right now, very distracting. They came up with this standard set of criteria, which you saw as far as like, there are the principles that are strengths-based and engaging youth as partners and sustainable and all those other things. And so they really tried to simplify the language that was being used and standardize it across Colorado. And part of that is a lot of the funders, whether that's like government, like if anybody gets funding from Office of Behavioral Health or Tony Gramsci's Youth Services, those are two really big funders for youth service organizations within Colorado. They all use the same PYD framework to, again, assess how youth serving organizations are using positive youth development theory without having to like confuse everybody and without having to like make everybody do all the super boring reading and like be using different terminology. I think that's all that I was going to say. If you can go to the next slide, Liz, I'm gonna kick it over to Amber to try to explain why what I just like ranted about matters to you guys.
Thanks so much, Catherine. I'm sorry, I'm going to be rude and bump in for just a second to say that also all of the PYD criteria and like all the stuff that we have today was developed by surveying both youth and youth serving adults, which is a really cool part of it. They actually asked those people what was important to them. So I just wanted to add that in there.
Yeah, definitely important thing to bring up as well, Stasi. Thank you. So why did we talk about this? Other than the fact that it was very entertaining and G. Stanley Hall's beard is amazing. First and foremost, the fact that PYD has evolved this way and these definitions of adolescence have evolved this way shows that adults are still learning about young people, right? It's an evolving sector, it's an evolving body of knowledge, which means that your voice and your lived experiences definitely matter as a young person. You are part of this evolving body of knowledge. Nobody knows everything about young people, and you can tell if you look at the history of people trying to say that they knew everything about young people and then finally admitting that they didn't. And then also the fact that well-respected youth services organizations require PYD practices for some kinds of grant funding, like Catherine was talking about, if you're funded by OBH or Tony Gramscis and things like that, it shows that PYD is important and effective. So that means, first of all, that you deserve to advocate for PYD principles to be used in your workspaces. And it also means that you can leverage that importance when you are talking to your supervisors, not only for PYD principles to be used in what they're doing, but also if there's something that you want to do or change about your own work, if you can find a way that it adheres to a PYD principle, that's a great strategy to use and say, hey, this is why we should do this, or why you should let me do this, because it adheres to PYD. And you know that's important, right? And they do. So that is why we wanted to discuss this today. We can go ahead and kick it over to the next slide as well. So I wanted to talk about workplace culture. Every workplace has a culture. It's the way that people treat each other, the things that they expect from each other, and the things that are just kind of generally expected from everyone by the workplace itself as its own like entity. It's usually in the form of rules and policies or handbooks, but it's also daily interpersonal interactions. So these dynamics can become a little unpredictable or mesh in ways that are less than ideal when you introduce power imbalances. And people who have variable life experiences and social identities can often approach workplace cultural values in very different ways. And when I talk about this variation, I'm not only talking about the difference in generations or age ranges, but also in race, ethnicity, culture, and abled or disabled status. We bring our life experiences into our places of work by default. And so when those life experiences are very different or even in some ways opposing, that can carry over. So let's look at a couple of these, for example. Think about how the kind of vague ideas about professionalism that we hear about in the workplace can be different for different people. I think it's completely professional to be really open and vulnerable about what's going on in my life so that the people I work with can understand where I'm coming from. I have not met a lot of colleagues who are over the age of 30 that agree with that sentiment. It's also important to remember that workplace cultural features can often be used, whether it's on purpose or not, to maintain or increase those power imbalances that I mentioned earlier. So think maybe about dress codes or codes revolving around hairstyles and how often that can be unequally applied towards people of color. Standardizing traditionally Black hairstyles as unprofessional or unacceptable, that kind of thing, it increases that power imbalance. So bearing all of this in mind, know that workplace cultures should be created in ways that include and respect everybody, regardless of their social identities. You have a right as a young person, or as any person, to speak out when workplace cultures are harmful or uncomfortable, even if they've been like that for a while, even if it's the way things have been done before. So we can move on to the next slide.
Thank you so much for that, Amber. So now we would love to hear some of your examples of principles and have you describe how that impacted your work. Did positive experiences make your work outcomes better? If so, how? Did negative experiences make your work outcomes worse? If so, how? This slide shows summaries of some of Amber and Mai's own examples. Does anyone have an example that they'd like to share and describe how it impacted your work?
And you can feel free to draw from examples that y'all talked about in the breakout groups as well.
I have one I'd like to share. So my job let me have a mental health week. A month ago, I was having a really hard time with some personal stuff. I have CPTSD and I had a really nasty, I don't know, it's probably not the right word, but like a flare up. I was just feeling really triggered and overwhelmed. And they let me take the whole week, no issues, let me come right back. I was so worried I was going to lose my job, but they're like, nope, that's fine. Anytime you need that, that's fine with us. Just come back and do a good job when you can. So that was very encouraging, made me feel very included and safe in that work environment.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
I know for me in my job at a local coalition, when I first joined, we had a lot of issues where I'd be in work groups. That was a mix of youth and adults, and they would just out of the blue schedule meetings for like 2 p.m., which obviously doesn't work because I have school at 2 p.m. And it really just created the sense a lot in my first few months there that like our opinion was sort of tokenized and they didn't really care about us actually being there. Otherwise, they'd kind of schedule the meetings when we could show up. And that's changed a lot. We kind of changed our frameworks, made sure that youth were more advocated for. And so I think that's a huge contrast now that makes me and my peers feel like we belong more, is really getting to see like, okay, they're scheduling not only around school, but around extracurriculars. And we're really all being as flexible as possible to make sure that everyone feels as though like they want to be supported and included. And that's been awesome.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Does maybe one more person want to share?
I'll be the one more person. I volunteer as tribute. It's okay. So I'll talk about this first example that we have on the negative experiences side. That one is mine. This is again from the former organization that I was talking about earlier. So I had this project that I spent probably about 2 weeks working on, and like I had been directed to do it. I didn't just come up with it. It was something that we had metrics for, and I was supposed to be on track for it, and I got it done in time for the community coalition board meeting. It was on the agenda for me to share out the results. And then in the middle of the meeting, my supervisor was like, we're not going to do that. We don't have time today. And we just never came back to the project. We never used the data I collected. We never used the handouts I developed for anything. And so when you think about how work outcomes are affected by that, it made the actual work not as good, right? Like it affected me personally, of course, but the work that we were doing didn't have that input, and it had been important input that several people wanted, not just me. And so it actually degraded the quality of the work itself. So when you exclude young people from being able to offer what they've already worked on, then you exclude the benefits of that work as well. So we just wanted to help kind of contextualize how PYD principles actually contribute to the work outcomes, because that's what we work for, right? We work to produce results. Stasi, are you okay to move on to the stretch break, or did you want to share one of yours real quick?
No, we can totally move on. These slides, I believe, and definitely the recording will be available after if you want to check out some of our other examples.
Yes. So yeah, we're going to have another stretch break real quick. There are only two main sections of the presentation left. And so this one we will run until 6:10, and we'll rejoin for these last couple of sections. Thank you. All right, hopefully everyone has had the opportunity to get back to their computers, phones, whatever you're using to join us. So we are going to get into some self-advocacy strategies. We're getting into some self-advocacy strategies to advocate for PYD in your workspaces. And I just wanted to start off by saying that these are not a list of sequential steps. You don't have to use this as an itinerary of like, do this first and then this and then this. You're going to be mixing strategies a lot, probably. You can go ahead to the next slide, Liz. So just in general for self-advocacy, identify your why. What is it that you want changed? Why is it affecting you? Make sure that you have that really solid as your purpose so that you can explain if anybody asks, why you're advocating for anything, whether it's PYD or this is again just general self-advocacy. Make some time. Request undivided attention from the person that you'll be talking to or making a request from, and make sure that it's enough time that you can actually talk to them and listen to their responses and respond in kind and everything. And then make a plan. One thing that I've heard a lot from any supervisor is that it can be really hard when people bring problems with no solutions. And while it is the responsibility of the supervisor to ultimately find and implement solutions for you, it can be really helpful to bring suggestions for how changes could be made, or at least specific examples of what you want it to look like once it has been changed, or both. Definitely be persistent. If asking once didn't work, don't be afraid to ask again later. Maybe someone's in a different mood later, or something circumstantial has changed, or ask the next person up in the chain of command. If your direct supervisor is unwilling to do something that you find important, go to their direct supervisor. It's completely acceptable. That's how workplaces work. And don't get pressured. Take time during the conversation to prepare your responses. Don't let anyone rush you into not saying things fully or saying something that you don't mean. And feel free to request, time to think. If someone says something that you weren't expecting, you can say, okay, can we circle back later? Maybe we can come back to this at a different time. That's all completely acceptable. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Amber. Those were all super amazing. I just had a couple small things to add. One, the ideal version of self-advocacy is that you have an ally to help you through the process. My past supervisor said to me that she really loved when youth employees advocated for themselves to her because it made it really clear for her to know how to support us and that it improved the youth adult partnership. And second, it is important to recognize small accomplishments in self-advocacy so we don't lose steam or get burned out as easily. But we can also recognize that these small accomplishments aren't the end game and more progress still needs to be done. So it can be really helpful to recognize both sides of that.
Yeah, thank you for bringing those things up, Stasi. Those are definitely important to bear in mind, really no matter what you're doing if you're trying to improve something. So I am going to get a little bit into more detail about different strategies. I'm not trying to get so specific that you can't apply this to your work no matter what you're doing, but I'm going to start by digging into different language strategies. It's literally the bones of what you're going to say when you're looking to advocate for something for yourself. So first and foremost, I literally can't stress this enough. Don't kneecap your sentences. What I mean when I say this is when you make a statement or ask a question, just let it stand on its own. You don't have to follow up with things like, if that's okay, or if that makes sense, or sorry, I know that's a lot. Adding things like this to what you say makes it sound like you aren't deserving of what you're asking or aren't deserving of the person's time. And while it's totally relatable and understandable to feel that way internally, it's absolutely not true. And so avoiding saying things out loud that might make it sound like it is true is going to be a key piece of self-advocacy. And then I talked on the last slide about taking the time to make a plan for what you want to say or ask. And in making that plan, it's completely okay to look for very specific language you can use while you're doing it. Even if you need a full written script to feel comfortable, that's completely fine. I know sometimes I feel like I'm supposed to have everything really polished, like there's this expectation that if you know what you're talking about, you should be able to have it memorized, but that's just not doable or accessible for everybody, and that's okay. You're not less knowledgeable just because you need reminders or because it's hard for you to speak without a guideline, because also you made the guideline, right? You made the words and the ideas. It's still yours and your work, and it's not cheating to use it. And then when it comes to these more one-on-one interactions, give yourself permission to interact on the same level as whoever you're talking to. I know sometimes I feel like when an authority figure or a supervisor or whoever tells me that I can call them by their first name, I kind of secretly feel like they don't mean it, or they think I'm being disrespectful if I actually do it. But I've found through experience that that's really not true, and making yourself feel like an equal will help others see you the same way. And in those same terms of establishing the respect that you've truly already earned just by being a human doing a professional activity, be willing to call people out if they interrupt you or if they're mischaracterizing something that you said. You're allowed to say, I didn't say that, or that's not what I meant when I said blank, or you didn't let me finish my sentence. In that same vein, practice active listening too. Make sure your responses are authentic and relevant. One really good specific strategy for this is to repeat back what someone just said in your own words. Tell someone, so what I'm hearing you say or answer is blank, and wait for confirmation before you respond. This shows your thoughtfulness about the conversation and really helps to reinforce your competence. And we can go to the next slide. If I can get to the next slide, there we go. And now I'm going to move on to more of the logistics side of self-advocacy. Maybe one of the biggest parts of that idea being scheduling. If you've recognized that your time is just as valuable as everyone else's, or you're working on recognizing that like me, then the next step is to sort out how to use your time most effectively. So think outside the box about your scheduling and be willing to try and take everyone else on that ride with you where it's appropriate and doable. A lot of professional workspaces are still stuck in that Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 mentality, which is often difficult to mesh with your life, especially as a young person, and especially if you're still in school, whether it's high school or college. So don't be afraid to push for the accessibility to work outside these times if it works better for your life, particularly if that flexibility is something you're asking for only for yourself. And in that same vein, there's never a wrong reason to get a note to excuse your scheduling needs and or absences. Ask your boss for a note to excuse you from a class because you have a conference you can't miss, or ask your teacher for a note to excuse you from the quarterly office meeting because you have a final exam that's happening at the same time. You can leverage the fact that there are some things you can't move in your professional, academic, and personal schedules in order to move other things that can be moved. In doing that, you can also look at the potential to move things online or asynchronous. I mean, how many times have we been in a meeting and definitely thought this could have been an email? Next time, maybe recommend it be an email. And also the final thing to consider with this is how much time you'll need for each task. It's always better to estimate high and then have spare time left over rather than estimate low and end up needing more time for something. And then on this right panel, I've got more about just knowing what you have the right to and what you are able to reasonably ask for. I don't like to say demand, but it kind of is that. Read policies, find out what you're entitled to as far as time off, medical accommodations, what the processes are for filing complaints if that ever arises, and so on and so forth. One thing I found to be super useful is if you are disabled or you have anything you seek psychiatric support for, if it's something you can feel emotionally comfortable with, take the opportunity to use that disclosure statement that most workplaces ask about when you get hired, where it asks you to check off any conditions that you might suffer from. Even if you don't think you're going to need accommodations, it's best to have it on the record that you do have a reason to seek them if you ever decide to. And then speaking of accommodations, definitely don't be afraid to ask for them, whether that's something as simple as the leniency to be 5 to 10 minutes late without a penalty because you struggle with time management, or maybe your transportation method is sometimes late because you take public transit or catch a ride from someone who isn't great at time management. Or it could be something as big as seeking an agreement to be allowed 1 or 2 unpenalized absences a month because you struggle with your mental health. Whatever it is, speak to your HR department and see if it's something that you can work out. And that brings me to my final point, which is always have a paper trail. Ideally, if your organization is using PYD well and is working smoothly, you should never need a paper trail, but sometimes things happen. It's best and also easiest all around if there's something in writing to show what was said, what was agreed upon, what deadlines or requirements were set, and so on. That can even be as simple as having a little running document on your desktop for notes of conversations with your supervisor, or having a miscellaneous folder where you keep all those random little policy change emails. And as a bonus, keeping those kinds of things on track or recorded can usually help your to-do list feel a lot more organized as well. So we are going to jump into the next section as well as the next slide, which is going to be a Q&A session. We have about 10 minutes left of the presentation. And we'll only take a few minutes for resources at the end. So the floor is completely open, chat or voice, whatever you're most comfortable with.
Please do keep thinking of questions or just anything else that you want to say to us. And I'll just say Amber and I have both of our emails on here if you have questions later. And Peyton has a question for us. What components of PYD are most commonly overlooked in creating a program? Oh, that's a good question. I'll think for a minute.
While Stazi's thinking, I will just offer my 2 cents on it. I do think the building authentic relationships part of PYD is most often overlooked because it's something that's really hard to like write into a policy or make a rule about. I mean, how do you standardize people creating authentic relationships with each other when part of that authenticity comes from like the spontaneity and the diversity? And so I don't really necessarily have a one size fits all answer to that as far as how you can make sure that an organization does kind of codify that. But that's the biggest thing I look out for, is if the actual individuals that are supervising me, mentoring me, whatever, are the kind of people who want to create authentic relationships, because that's the key to that component.
Yeah, thank you, Amber. I think from my experience, I don't know that this is like most commonly overlooked, but I think something that can be difficult to truly do really well in all aspects is being inclusive, because when people are in the privileged portion, like a white person versus a person of color, it's often overlooked what differences there might be that we need to address or think about. And so I think thinking about all the different ways to be inclusive and to make a space inclusive so that people from all backgrounds and perspectives want to come can be really difficult. And it's important to try to think about those things outside of your own perspective, or at least it has been for me, and to try to remember those other things. I'll just read out some chats. Liliana said, that's a great point. This is something we have been working on in my programs, authenticity and creating a safe space for our clients. Liz says, I would agree with that, Amber. And I think that organizations sometimes have great intentions, but don't incorporate the planning, time, and thoughtfulness needed to actually integrate these components. Agreed. You're welcome to continue thinking and asking us things. As you can probably see on the slide, we do have an evaluation. I would really, really, really love it if all of you filled it out, because we really will look at it and use it for future trainings. I will also put the link in the chat, and we'll send out a follow-up email, and I'll include the evaluation in there, but it should only take you like 5, maybe 10 minutes to fill out.
All right, in the interest of respecting everybody's time, we can probably go ahead and move on to the resources slide. If I see any questions pop into the chat while we're just briefly talking about this, then we will definitely answer them. At the bottom of the slide here, I just have a couple of self-advocacy resources, the NDLC's 10 steps for self-advocacy and Disability California's 15 tips for self-advocates. And actually both of these resources are from self-advocates within the disability community. And I know that that's not what we were necessarily talking about today, but it turns out that self-advocacy for disability reasons applies to a lot of self-advocacy. So
Thank you. And also for the other resources on here, we have the PYD Toolbox linked that has a lot of PYD related resources. I found this website helpful specifically under the Home tab. They have pages on each principle, which have definitions, and they go into deeper explanations of the different sections that they have under each principle. So it's helpful for further information. And under the resources tabs, there's a lot of links and different things. And they also have videos, which personally I have found to be the most helpful. I will also say in general on this website, not everything on it has felt super useful or helpful to me as a young person. So, just take that with you as you go. But under the resources tab, there is a youth-friendly PYD in action tool, which may be helpful for examples of different like regression type things. I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense as progression in and of themselves, but it provides great examples. And under the PYD Toolbox, there's another tab on the youth training system, which is our YEETS training website. So feel free to check that out for access to recordings and training materials. And thank you all so very much for spending 2 hours with us tonight. We really appreciate it, and I really appreciate all the engagement.
Thank
Liz,
you
can
guys.
probably stop the recording too.